Association of World Citizens has been preoccupied with the violations of human rights and humanitarian law in many of the ongoing conflicts, such as those in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere. There is a vital need to reaffirm international humanitarian law, because if it is not done with a large outcry of people, not only governments but also citizen groups, the violations are likely to continue in what has been called the fog of war. There are basically four sources of humanitarian international law. The first, and which is the one that is often cited, are the Geneva Conventions, which are primarily Red Cross conventions, which deal with the treatment of health personnel, of hospitals, but also of prisoners of war, violations against civilians. The Red Cross conventions have been adapted to the new types of violations that have gone on since the Second World War. And they now also concern not only the armies of established and recognized governments, but also guerrilla groups and other forms of militias. Therefore, these regulations and conventions concern groups in such as those in the Middle East or those in Afghanistan, which are not state entities but are in some ways non-state entities but are armed services. The second source are what is called the Hague Tradition, which comes from the various banning of certain types of weapons that had begun with the Hague peace conferences, but has been continued since then, and concerns such weapons as the Convention on Anti-Personnel Landmines, as cluster munitions, as chemical weapons, as biological weapons. So there is a whole series of weapons that have been banned, but that, alas, are still being used in some of these conflicts. And we have had reports, verified reports of the use of chemical weapons in the Syria conflict. The third source of humanitarian international law are the human rights conventions. The human rights conventions deal with human rights which are applicable everywhere and at all times. Nevertheless, we know that in violent conflicts, human rights are especially violated. The rights of prisoners, against torture, of the inability to write in the press, etc. So that the human rights conventions are extremely important. The last conventions are those linked to the UNESCO list of sites that are part of the heritage of humanity. Very recently, the International Criminal Court condemned a northern Malian individual for having led attacks on Sufi tombs and mosques that were part of the heritage of humanity. Therefore, these four sources of humanitarian international law are all important, dealing with slightly different aspects, but now must be brought together into a coherent list and reinforced by work with the United Nations and with humanitarian organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross. This is one of the aims of the Association of World Citizens.